'Tis the season for graduations. Right now, however, some students are more than happy to leave some of their textbooks behind. But what sorts of books, the right sorts of books, should faithful readers want to take with them all their lives, not just starting in their childhood years and continuing in their teenage years, but into their lives as Christ-following grown-ups? Today's guest has given many a graduation speech, and he is also the author of Middle Grade Fantasy. Houston Christian University President Dr. Robert Sloan.
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Don't stand on ceremony at Fantastical Truth, this podcast from Lorehaven.com, where we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I am me, Stephen Burnett, journalism graduate and the publisher of Lorehaven, and the author of a science fiction novel released a couple of months ago from Enclave Publishing called Above the Circle of Earth. Also, the host of this podcast, flying solo today. This is episode 262. How do great stories train students to follow Jesus as adults? While some of you were graduating or attending the ceremony of a graduate, I was in Tennessee. I was at the Teach Them Diligently conference in Pigeon Forge with the folks at the Realm Makers bookstore. I've been there before. Some of you longtime listeners of this podcast may remember me talking about those events. Last year, I took a break to work on the sci-fi novel editing process. But now that novel is out, and so am I. So I was able to rejoin some friends at that event. Clint Hull, Mike Narakis, Scott, and Becky Miner of the Realm Makers Conference, which, by the way, is not just a writers' conference anymore. It is a whole expo coming this July 18th through 20th at the DeVos Convention Center in Grand Rapids. We've been talking about that at the top of the show, not just because they're good friends of ours, but because we want to make this event as big as possible by letting you know that, hey, it's not just for creatives now, it's also for fans. This is the first of its kind Christian-run fan conference. All kinds of amazing creators will be there, not just fantastical authors like myself and Lorehaven and some folks you might know from this podcast, but also folks who have been working at this for a very long time. We are talking Mike Naraki, the co-creator of VeggieTales and the voice actor of Larry the Cucumber, and lately of the Dead Sea Squirrels books, an animated series. New York Times bestselling fantasy author Brent Weeks, Green Ember series author S.D. Smith, 100 Cupboards author N.D. Wilson, no relation, even though they share the initial D, along with Monkey D. Luffy. Here's a new one I found out about a few weeks ago. Tony Bancroft, the director of the original Disney's Mulan, as well as a longtime Disney animator. He's got his own studio now, doing some amazing things. Dedicated Christian fellow. Turns out there's a lot of Christians in the animation industry, y'all. There are dozens of us. Katie Lee is coming. She is a longtime voice actress going back to the 1980s, and Christian kids especially know her because she has been Connie Kendall from the very early days of Adventures in the Odyssey. Great, great lady. Also, Alex Magnus Lehman, the director of creative management for research and development at Riot Games, a live sketch comedy radio troupe called Main Street Music Show, and a bunch of fantasy authors and other creatives. As I mentioned, including myself, I'll be at the Lorehaven booth along with some of our crew there, but I'll also be pitching Above the Circle of Earth, my science fiction debut. You can get more info at realmmakers.com to sign up for the event. Registration is open now. You can go to the Writers Conference, of course, but it's also just a very, very fan-focused event, including cosplay and really, really cool stuff. By the way, the Realm Makers bookstore will be in Florida just a week or so from now. I have those dates up here just a moment ago, but you can get those in the show notes for this episode 262, along with all of our other sponsors and allies there. At Lorehaven, we have been back on the review circuit. New reviews every week of the best Christian-made fantastical novels we can find, including Echo Nova, the YA fantasy from Clint Hall. We just reviewed that. And then this coming week, we have a review coming out for a different sort of time travel novel, more of a time travel romance between two different historical periods called Every Hour Until Then, written by Gabrielle Meyer. And spoiler alert, she's also the guest in our very next episode of this podcast. You can subscribe free to join Lorehaven, join the mission, help others find these stories and find the best of them for yourself and your loved ones. We'll also send you the exclusive access code to join the Lorehaven Guild, our Castle in the Cloud on Discord. Our first sponsor for this episode is Champion Enclave Publishing with their new novel just released last week, War Safe, from Enclave Escape by author Lauren Smith. Play, win, survive. There's one building on her island that Haley has never visited, the Mercenary House. Perched atop a mountain, surrounded by unnaturally evergreen foliage, the house is rumored to be a breeding ground for criminals. Mercenaries are liars, cheats, spies, and maybe, depending on who you ask, killers. At the War Safe headquarters in Seattle, Roscoe is beta testing the company's new video game. It's her job to track down glitches, but something is different about this one. Lurking behind the lines of malfunctioning code is a secret that threatens to drag her deeper into the game, forcing her to put her life on the line if she ever wants to come home. Worlds collide as Roscoe teams up with Haley to uncover the island's secret and expose WarSafe's designs. But some mysteries are better left unsolved. As traitor after so-called traitor is revealed to be on their side, they begin to wonder, could WarSafe's mission be critical enough to justify its cruelty? Enclave Escape presents War Safe by author Lauren Smith, available on May the 6th, available now wherever fantastic books are sold. Ask for it at your favorite bookseller or your local library, or order it online at Amazon or enclavepublishingstore.com. That's also an audiobook from Oasis Audio. More info in the show notes for this episode 262. While you're checking that out, keep it running in the background because our guest is now entering the studio, Houston Christian University President, Dr. Robert Sloan. Dr. Robert Sloan has strode in like a cowboy from the setting sun. He's the author of the young adult fantasy series Hamelin Stoop, and he grew up in West Texas, so I guess we are neighbors. He says the setting of the Hamelin Stoop series is near to his heart. He's also married to his college sweetheart, Sue. 7 married children and over 20 grandchildren, so you know a little something about parenting there, Dr. Sloan. You all enjoy large family gatherings with good food and lively conversation around the table. Oh, by the way, you also happen to be a scholar and president of Houston Christian University, which Google, I'll notice, still calls Houston Baptist University, but I assume you all allow more than Baptist there. Either way, I'm good, but welcome to the Lorehaven studio.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you. And yes, a shame on Google, but that's okay. We've changed our name about 3 years ago, and it's been a good change for us. We're still historically a Baptist school. Yeah, I think a lot about not only raising children, but also about young people and adults at various stages of life and how can they be formed and shaped, including myself.
Well, that's an interest of mine as well. As a former child, some of the stories that I enjoyed at a young age were fantasy stories. And that leads me to chapter 1. We're kind of going to go through each of the age groups here, ending with our graduation special. Children growing up to adulthood, graduating and moving on. And our goal here is to show that the fantasy stories we enjoyed at younger ages can still serve us as we seek to glorify Jesus through our careers, our scholarship. We can be very smart academics and wise men and wise women, and yet still some of these simple stories have great benefits for us. So chapter 1, children need adult rules for great fantasy. Adults have the responsibility of training children in the best case scenarios of finding these wonderful stories and then knowing just a little bit, even from a young age, about what these stories are for. And in my case, the fantasy stories I first enjoyed were actually a biblical fiction cartoon called Superbook. There was a sort of magical book. They didn't say it was magical, but it was. It shone with light and it had the power. It wasn't a Bible, but it had the power to send 2 children and a robot back into ancient times of Bible days. And at the same time of learning about fantasy and science fiction and time travel and all of this, I was learning Bible stories from the Old and New Testaments. And somehow I was able to keep them apart. Some people, I think, struggle with biblical fiction and say, well, they're adding to the Bible. But I still remember as a kid thinking, okay, I know the difference here. There was no robot in the Old Testament. I'm pretty sure that I don't see that in the Bible. It helps to go to a local church and have some Christian training on the nonfiction side there. Later on, I entered Narnia, like so many young Christian readers do, and many other worlds. And I feel that I was very blessed back then, simply because one way or another, my parents encouraged reading, if for no other reason than book time was unlimited. There were very few rules on the books, but computer time was limited. You've been spending entirely too much time on that computer game, even if it's an educational one. You need to go outside, Stephen. You need to read some books instead. That's what I remember anyway. And at least from my vantage as a former child, I would strongly recommend the same general approach for kids. In other words, limited game and screen time, not because it's bad, but because it can certainly boost those dopamine levels in a way you don't want to get hooked on. But books are more substantive, like stories and imagination, healthy stories and imagination certainly cultivate the mind in ways that games and screen time cannot. I think games and screen time count as dessert, but the books are like the meat and vegetables and the essential ingredients that healthy growing kids need. That goes a double, I think, for books that illustrate biblical truth and beauty and goodness. With your experience raising this many children, now adult, and then having so many grandchildren in your life, first off, what a wonderful legacy that is. Before we even talk about the academic side of it, with students getting older and graduating from university, what have you noticed about this challenge of raising kids then as now, especially with the challenge of getting them great fantastical stories as opposed to games and screen time?
I do think that encouraging reading is definitely the way to go. Reading is a discipline that is much more challenging than watching a screen. Watching a screen is a much more passive activity. Although I will say that the screen, the TV, the film, it has some great value, obviously, because it can do some things in a spectacular way in terms of scenery and action events that can liven and quicken the imagination and expand it. But it's you're being a little more spoon fed visually for that experience. Whereas in reading a book, it requires a lot of discipline. It requires a mental discipline. It requires a physical discipline even to read a book. And I find it very challenging. Of course, the value of reading for children, particularly reading fantasy and fairy tales and myths and science fiction, those kinds of things give credence to the worldview that's so necessary for understanding the Bible. The Bible does have is a world in which God is active in the world. He's not a deistic God who has made a clock and wound it up and moved at a distance. He is involved. And so when he is dramatically involved, there are signs and wonders and spectacular things that happen. And it's very important to realize that is the kind of world in which we continue to live. Our modern world sort of beats a lot of that out of us. It strips that supernatural worldview away from us. But it's so important, again, to read those kinds of books.
I resonate so much with that. And I'd like to ask you a little bit more of a personal question, too. How has this been proved, do you think, in your own life? I mean, many Christians, of course, have different views about magic. Some may feel less comfortable using that word. Some may want fantastical stories that don't have magic. Some may be more comfortable with more contemporary stories or missionary biographies. But with you, it sounds like you got a hold of this early enough, and maybe similar to me, this did not tempt you into occult worldviews or things. Like, it seems in your case to have led to a flourishing career of even training others to go deeper into the biblical worldview rather than being compromised by imagination or speculations that have nothing to do with Scripture.
That's certainly been the case for me. I don't mind references to magic because there are occult practices in the Bible. In fact, I've known people who could give testimony to the fact that it was the occult that led them back to a supernatural worldview, which led them back to the plausibility of the biblical story. So I don't advise that as a way to have a pilgrimage, but I do think, I mean, we certainly get magic. You get Simon the sorcerer in the New Testament. We get the girl who is possessed by the spirit of Python that Paul cast the demon out of. And so we get Paul saying in 1 Corinthians that there are many so-called gods in the world, and he goes on in chapter 10 to describe these as demonic powers. So I think it's okay. Obviously, care must be given because there is an addictive force to the occult. But we believe in spiritual powers. It's part of the Christian worldview.
We absolutely do. What are some ways that you, especially as a parent, have helped to train your children before we even speak of students? Your role in helping disciple other people's children once they get closer to that adult age. But just as a father, how have you been able to set expectations, boundaries, like any particular stories that you can think of that you recommended to your kids, or stories about how they discovered reading or some of the challenges that you faced?
Well, we used to read to them. That was something we did early on. Even as the little children, we would read age-appropriate books for them and read to them and teach them how to read. And in addition to reading, we made it a point to have meals together as a family. You couldn't have every meal together, but we would do our very best to have the evening meal together, and we would talk. We would tell stories. We would do puzzles and riddles, play minute mysteries, and do those kinds of things together as a family. The other thing that was really important, I think, for formation for children is everybody had a responsibility. So the kids used to say growing up that in our household, next to the Bible, the most important document in the house was the job chart that was stuck on the refrigerator door. Everybody had a responsibility, and so just building those structures of accountability and love and participation and working together. But mealtime, hospitality is a huge thing, and it's a big thing in a lot of, if you think about it, it's a big thing not only in the Bible, but also in a lot of the famous stories. I mean, the C.S. Lewis stories, the Narnia Chronicles, I mean, the meals are very important. The same is true in That Hideous Strength, when the characters towards the end, it's almost like a last supper that they have together right before Merlin the magician comes. So meals and fellowship are very important, and in the Bible, they're connected with the powerful presence of God. The healing presence of Jesus is in those occasions as well. But we found, if I had one clue about raising children, it would be to be very open about your faith, to talk about God freely, because He is. I grew up in an era when people didn't talk as much about God. We were taken to church, but there was still sort of at home talk, at school talk, and church talk. I think the more you can integrate those levels of discourse in your family, the better off you are. But if I could say anything, it would be teach the Bible, have accountability, and love your children. If your children know you love them, they will be attracted to the values that you hold. They'll want to embrace the things that you believe in. So, those are my major clues for how to raise children.
Well, I'm sure it certainly helps to be in the family business of learning, of scholarship, of education. And yet at the same time, I think that any Christian family that's being led by a strong and loving father and mother can set the direction of the family. One of the things I always wondered growing up was, hey, where are we going with this? What's the end game? What quest is the family on? And I think that the biblical worldview provides that. The family's quest is to be part of a local church, lowercase c, which is part of the big capital C church, which is Christ's bride on earth, being ambassadors for the coming kingdom. We're discipling one another. We are benefiting the world as best we can through our jobs, through raising families. And then it really, in my view now, goes back to the creation mandate or the cultural mandate that God gave Adam and Eve in Genesis 1:28. The family calling and the culture making calling are really the same calling. And then that gets sharpened still more by the Great Commission, which is Christ's way to spread the gospel and disciple people in a world that has rejected him. So I see both of those callings intertwined for the mission of the Christian family. And I think that kids can catch on to that pretty early. Surely they can catch on to the purpose of the family. Here's what we're here for, even if they may need to grow up a little bit in order to be able to articulate that. But you can catch, as a kid, you can catch those ideals through the stories that your parents are recommending or that friends from church are recommending. And then maybe even catch them secondhand from stories by non-Christians. Go ahead.
No, Stephen, that's beautifully said. I agree wholeheartedly. All of these topics that we're talking about, whether it's Bible reading or storytelling or writing stories, or the family as a microcosm of the church, of the local church, of the bride of Christ, of God's cultural mandate given in Genesis 1. Those are powerful concepts, and one of the best things we can do with children is not only people can intuitively learn about story structure. It's sort of in the fabric of who and what we are. But to tell them God's story, to me, you can't understand the Bible without understanding the larger story of Scripture. But once you grasp what you call the cultural mandate or the commissioning of Adam and Eve to do God's work in the world, to be His stewards in the world, you've got a colossal rebellion and fall. You've got a plan of rescue, the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel's failure, but Israel is the agency through whom God is going to save the world. Jesus is the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, who's also the Messiah, the King of for the Gentiles, et cetera, et cetera. So the plan of restoration is not just the forgiveness of sins and faith in Christ. That begins the plan of restoration. Now we are enabled to go back and do God's work in the world again. So these things are best communicated with story. In fact, it is a story. It's God's story. And helping your children see that will enable them to read the Bible, and it really enables all of us. And you've said it already, to have that larger sense of what my mission in life is, a larger sense that I don't just have a job to make money, that I have a vocation that enables me to do God's work in the world, to be His steward. It's powerful.
Amen to that. I remember it feeling so illuminated biblically when I got hold of that idea you alluded to, Christian vocation, and then traced it back to the creation mandate / cultural mandate. It really lit up a lot of biblical truth that I think had been at the edges of my vision. By the way, do you prefer cultural mandate or creation mandate? I go back and forth on that. I just wonder if you could sway me one way or the other before we move on.
Well, I think the cultural mandate is a subset of the creation mandate. I mean, ultimately, there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. So God loves the creation. He made the creation be a new heaven, new earth. But of course, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world, and they that dwell therein. So they that dwell therein, we are tied up in the creation, but we create a culture, a human culture. So it's pretty hard to separate the two ultimately.
Gotcha. Well, my understanding is that they're kind of two labels, but that makes sense to think of the creation or the cultural mandate as kind of a subset of creation mandate there. Go out and make families, get married, make families in a fallen world, make families if you can. And certainly the shepherding of creation, the stewardship of creation itself is part of that before we're making new what Tolkien would call subcreations.
Exactly.
And you've made a subcreation too, which we categorize in the Lorehaven library, because I think we list all 5 books there of the Hamelin Stoop series as middle grade. So that would fit within this chapter where we're talking more about children before they get to their teenage years. I'm curious what led you to write this series, especially we already have so many amazing Christian fantastical stories for young readers going through middle grade. But where did you come in and decide, I think I'd like to try this as well? And then 5 books later, you've got the entire Hamelin Stoop series.
Thank you for that question. I can tell you the timeline of how it worked in my mind. And in retrospect, it got bigger. But the timeline was I was very much taken with the Harry Potter books. They were so popular. Of course, I had been a reader of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien before that, but was so taken by the visibility and the cultural impact of the Harry Potter books. I thought to myself, I mean, my grandchildren of reading age have read those. I don't mind them reading them at all. They're very powerful. They're a good yarn. I think you need, parental guidance to read along with you, because there is that occult element that can be sort of very attractive. But she's done a great job of building another world, and I think that's a good thing. But I wanted something. It motivated me. I thought, if these are the kinds of books that my grandchildren can read and want to read, and I want them to read Narnia and fantastical books, then I wanted to write books for them, and that's really the way I started. And so that was my motivation. And then what got me going was there was a story. There is a story, and this isn't too much of a spoiler, I don't think. But there is sort of an unfinished tale. My main character is named Hamlin. So there's an unfinished story of the Pied Piper, and the children were stolen away or taken away. The parents didn't live up to their word, and the children were stolen away. And so I remember as a kid sort of aching for the separation between parents and children. I thought, and so I was motivated by that story to try to want to write a story that where the children are looking for their parents, and parents for their children, and then of course to see if they can be reunited. It's in a very emotional way. So, but then the third step in my thinking was, as I started writing, I realized, like, I think every good story is, whether they realize it or not, whether it's written by a Christian or not, is a subset of God's bigger story in some way. I mean, the fabulous theological themes. Take Les Mis, for example. I mean, the substitution, the theft, the giving back of the gold pieces. The priest sings and prays and says, "I've given you back your life for God." So great themes of substitution. So anyway, I think every story partakes of that bigger story of Scripture. So in my thinking, in my scholarship, what I have worked on for most of my scholarly life was what I would call you could call it the canonical problem, or the story of the Bible. How do the Old and New Testaments fit together? Or what is biblical theology? And I've come in my later senior academic years to believe that the story of the Bible is biblical theology. That is the Christian worldview. So I wanted this book to convey this in a very subterranean way. I don't use a lot of theological language, almost none. But I wanted to use a story of myth and fantasy, of home, of loss, to retell the story of the Bible, again, in a very subterranean way. So that's what motivated me.
That's an interesting term, subterranean. Might like to think about that a little bit more. I was thinking recently, however, about how Lewis explained his creation of Narnia process, and how this is often misunderstood, even by those who would want to imitate him. It's often reduced, I think, in its complexity to, well, Lewis just followed the story, and then the Christian ideas just got in there almost by accident. And that's not what Lewis said he did. He certainly did not say, sure, I started out with a committee to decide to put together Sunday school lessons for kids, and we picked fairy tales because they're popular, and then off we went in order just to indoctrinate people. He said, I couldn't write that way at all. He said, my story process started with images, and then I gave them form in order to get some art out of it. In this case, the fairy story, because of its brevity and for other strengths that it has. Like, okay, that thing I was thinking about, the lion and the fawn in the woods, like that needs to go into a fairy tale. So he has the bubbling of images, he gives it form, the fairy story. But then, this is what a lot of people miss, which I think you just articulated, Then Lewis says, then comes the man. The man needs to have his way too. And by man, he means the citizen, the responsible adult, the Christian with a purpose. Once he's got the bubbling of images given form, he's like, now here's the purpose. The purpose is to sneak past the watchful dragons. The purpose is to destigmatize the Sunday school associations with biblical ideas. So it's good, I think, as the end of the creative process to find the purpose of those stories. And for you, just articulating to retell that true mythology of the gospel through a fairy story in very similar ways. I think that's fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah. And, when I think of things that are subterranean, if you ask people, are the books of Tolkien, are they Christian books? Christians love those books, but there's no explicitly Christian theological language like Christ or redemption or the Spirit and so on. But all the deep motifs of good and evil, of heroism, of courage, of magic, and dragons and great fairy stories, it's all there. It reinforces the Christian faith in a deeply subterranean way with all of the virtues that we think are foundational for what it means to be a Christian. You remind me of the book by C.S. Lewis, Till We Have Faces. And in the key passage, the main character realizes she had screamed and screamed and screamed at the gods. They were unfair to her. They were wicked. But she realized the gods didn't have to listen to her, quote, until we have faces, until there was a depth of character. And it's like the parable of the seed and the sower. Some of the seed falls by the wayside or it sprouts up too quickly because it has no root in itself. So I think when we raise children, just the formation of character, of virtue, with a sense of good and evil, they build. You're forming the kind of person who can appreciate and embrace the gospel. The gospel will be the most natural story in the world once they've heard it.
Exactly. I think that's why I like that word subterranean, because when you talk about creativity, I often think for the Christian, the biblical worldview and all that purpose, that goes into the foundation. Like the parable Jesus told, the wise man who did an act of cultural creation built his house upon the rock. Those biblical ideas are in the foundation and they are assumed. They're axiomatic. And you don't argue them to kids. You just teach them. You show them. You illustrate them. You can get into the argument and such later on as they get older and starts to challenge things. But for the time being, for the types of fantasy stories that are most suitable for young children, it is most suitable to presume those biblical goodnesses and beauties and truths and to presume the gospel. We can defend it later and challenge it and all that stuff through storytelling and nonfiction. But at such a young age, it's best just to show it and then wait till they get a little bit older, which leads us to our second chapter. We'll get to that in just a moment. Gonna step through the curtains real quick here and whisper in the good doctor's ear so we can pause for our second sponsor, Jonathan Karagiannis, with a upcoming novel called Omega Plan. This is a mythopoetic sci-fi fantasy novel with the epic style of Brandon Sanderson, the conspiracy of the X-Files, and the theology of the Bible. It is the first book in the Era of the End saga, which explores the apocalypse from a unique angle, focusing on the problem of evil, conspiracy, and ultimately faith and hope. For centuries, occult secret societies have been working behind world empires preparing for an alien invasion. Two of these societies, the Cabal and the Alliance, plot to help humanity withstand the coming wrath and fire. When America invades the Middle East after a terrorist attack on home soil, the schemes of the Cabal and the Alliance entangle and threaten the identities of a Marine captain, a demigod chief turned criminal, a trafficked super soldier woman, and an ex-con man whose eyes have opened to the truth. The purifying fire shall burn, the kingdom of heaven will conquer earth, the holy ones will arise, and Omega Plan is coming out on May 30th. Pre-order your paperback or Kindle copy on Amazon now. Get that link in the show notes for this episode 262. All right, back to our conversation. Chapter 2 now. We've talked about the children at length, and some people, including well-meaning Christians, would be happy to stop here and assume that fantasy is for kids. But once we get older, once we become adults, once we even maybe become teenagers, well, now it's time to put away childish things. We here at Lorehaven do not cotton to that sort of thing, and I imagine you don't either. Nonetheless, let's talk about teens and YA for just a little bit here. And Dr. Sloan, I think that this is actually the most popular, second to middle grade stories, maybe, but I think YA stories are the most popular fiction now. Certainly for Christians who enjoy fantasy, it seems to me that almost every story that I see from Christian fantastical authors is either for teens and YA, young adults, or it's like YA adjacent. Like it may have older characters, but they're like just past the teenage years, and the themes and the style are very accessible to teens and young adults. That is not to say that these stories are simple. I think that often this is the time, in my opinion, and I want to hear yours in a moment, but this is the time for the stories to get a little bit more complex because the readers are now getting a little more complex. Where I mentioned earlier that certain beliefs about the Christian worldview are axiomatic. We take them for granted. They are first principles. They're baked into the foundation. Teenagers want to dig a little deeper. At least I certainly did. We want to challenge some things. We want to take them apart. We want to ask, hey, how is this built? Can it withstand the storms of life? Is this foundation sure? And I think some people take that too far and they do some deconstruction down to the foundation. Which can lead to some very harmful directions. But it is okay for teenagers or older readers to test for the weak points, to get a little bit more complex with their stories. And the stories will often illustrate this struggle. I think that includes some secular books that may challenge certain biblical beliefs in a way that is not helpful. But it may also include some Christian-made books that challenge these beliefs in a way that is helpful. That allow teens and younger readers to come alongside and just ask, okay, is this good? Is this really true? Is this really good? Is this really beautiful? And then by the end, they either get a persuasive resolution, like, yes, it is. These beliefs, this truth of the gospel is worth fighting for in a fantasy world as in the real world. And we feel like we've been on that journey through fiction, maybe even before we've been on a similar journey as grown-ups. I can remember many stories, by the way, that dealt with themes like this and helped me prepare for later attacks on my faith through the trials of life or through hostile worldviews that are not helpful. I felt like I'd already been there a little bit thanks to the stories I'd enjoyed, and that was part of the training. Of course, there are some risks here. Some stories will provide false answers, and that's why I love what you said earlier about reading stories out loud to your kids, starting early on. And then later on, I'm guessing that if kids are being raised to be readers, even as teenagers, they will want to find stories on their own and read stories on their own. But hopefully you still have a foundation then for talking about them. Like I like what you said about the Harry Potter series, which kind of straddles these age groups, right? It starts off middle grade, but then it becomes teen and YA, like right around the midpoint of book 4. It's a kind of strange when you think about it. But we want to either way, I think, have already trained younger children to expect that kind of discernment. I'm curious for you, like how this worked out for your kids as they were growing up past middle grade and then becoming teenagers, entering these young adult years. Like, do you want to share something that you can remember, like from your family or families you know? Like, how did that work out? Transitioning from younger children to teenagers and young adults.
Sure. Well, you're exactly right. There's bad things are happening all the time, but children are much less aware of it by and large. As parents, we try to protect them and keep them in a little bit more isolated. But of course, when a family member dies, or the family member of a friend dies, or God forbid, some child or some elementary school or teenage young person dies, then you can't avoid the really tough questions. Or when somebody gets into some kind of legal trouble, or somebody brings a gun to school, then that creates all kinds of chaos. And so having that format in that frame of reference with your own family structure to talk that is so extremely valuable to be able to talk to your kids. And I like what you said earlier about a lot of the reading that we can do, whether it's thoughtful Christian reading or secular reading, that really raises the problems of atheism, problems of pain, problems of suffering, problems of sin. Those kinds of things get brought out, and we have to deal with it. Well, and of course we should, because the story of the Bible, I mean, within, by the time we get to chapter 3, we've got the Great Rebellion going on, and we've got the curse of sin and death. The book of Judges is pretty hard reading. It is full of violence and people, and it's a good opportunity to learn the hermeneutic of the Bible, that not everything the Bible describes does it prescribe. So, but just dealing with the phases of life and the processes of growing up. If your children are readers, they will encounter these kinds of things. I remember one time walking into the house late in the afternoon. It was a Sunday afternoon. I'd been off preaching somewhere on Sunday morning, and I got back mid to late afternoon. And the kids were around the television set, and they were watching. I think it was the Judy Garland show, The Little Princess, and about the little girl who was looking for her dad, and he was finally healthy, and they found him. They thought he was dead, and it was so emotional. And one of the first questions my kids asked me, they turned around and said, "Daddy, is it true? Is it true?" They wanted to know if that story really happened. And that gave me a good opportunity to talk about life and talk about truthful things. But Easter, we're about to celebrate, this is the Easter season. And so, is it true? That's a really good question. And it's a vital question. And dealing with fears and anxieties and doubts, those are things that get multiplied in those middle school years. I think it's just part of growing up. And it's something the parents got to be prepared for. But reading can be such a great avenue into that.
Well, I remember one of the elements of the Harry Potter series that greatly helped me. And by now, by the way, I was past my own teenage years. And it's a familiar trope in some of the best fantasy, even some new fantasy. It's where the hero has some kind of power over his nemesis. Now, in this case, it may be a lesser nemesis that the hero does need to show some sympathy toward, who needs to avoid vengeance against. After all, Apostle Paul, quoting God himself, warns, "Vengeance is the Lord's. The Lord will repay. We are to love our enemies." And that can lead to some tough choices. And for Harry Potter, with Draco Malfoy, it led to tough choices in book 6, where he finds a spell from an unknown spell book. And by the way, this is J.K. Rowling warning you not to tamper with the occult, by the way, in her own special way. And in a fight with Draco Malfoy, Harry uses the spell, even though he doesn't know what it's going to do. And Draco is just ripped to shreds and lies there bleeding, and it is truly a victim of the power that Harry has found. And Harry is shocked and stunned and humbled to discover that his words literally have power to wound a person so grievously. And after that, it takes a while for Harry Potter to learn some lessons, but he actually decides, I'm never going to use this spell book again. This is terrible. This is stuff I ought not have anything to do with. And then in book 7, and it's a study on how a hero is to deal with his enemy, not just Lord Voldemort, who does need to go down, but also Draco Malfoy and the whole Malfoy family, who's being tangled up in things that they ought not be messing with. And I love that redemption story. Like, Harry and Draco are never friends forever or anything like that, but Harry has shown Draco mercy and eventually learns how to do that. And that was just such an amazing lesson for me that I already knew from the Bible. I already knew from sermons, from didactic teaching, but to see it illustrated, it's almost like a sermon illustration from someone who never ought to be preaching. Nonetheless, it captures a reality about the universe and a deep moral principle in a difficult situation. It's not just kids. Don't say mean things to people. No, not even the bully. Like it cranks it up to 11 now. And this one example in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, and you feel it. You don't just know it, you feel it.
That's so well said. That's the power of story altogether. it's one thing to have a list of rules in an abstract way, don't be mean, etc. But when you see the results of it, you see it in the shape of a human experience. It's so much more powerful.
Amen. Let's talk about growing up now and still hanging on to those powerful stories that we loved as children, especially if they're good ones. Another quick pause to observe that when you graduate, get a new job, launch yourself into the world, it can sometimes feel like the world is coming apart beneath your feet, which makes me think of our third sponsor, Dan Megill's novel Earthburst. This is the first in a science fiction adventure trilogy. Born to a warrior culture gifted with energy projection abilities, Aaron's sole ambition is to battle deceivers in service of the patrons. But when his talents attract attention from both sides of the conflict, he learns that he is the one who has been deceived. Now, to set things right, he must leave his home and take on an interstellar empire. And as he forges new allies and learns his own limits, this one boy's quest for truth will reverberate across his planet and change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. Earthburst by Dan Megill and the other two books in this science fiction adventure trilogy are available now on Amazon and Audible. To learn more, visit Megill.com. That is spelled Megill. To learn more about Earthburst by Dan Megill. See more in the show notes for this episode 262. All right, stepping back out to wrap up our conversation. And here I would like to ask you first, as we move into chapter 3, adults should be able to grow enough to enjoy fantasy again. How long have you been the president of Houston Christian University, and how many graduation ceremonies do you think you've seen during your tenure there?
Oh my goodness! Well, I do about an average of 5 or 6 a year. And so I've been here going on almost 19 years. So 6 times 9 is 54. So that's about 115 or so here at Houston Christian University. But I had another 10 years worth of graduations at another institution. So anyway, I've been to a lot of graduation ceremonies in my day.
That's at least over 160. I mean, it could be as much as 200 if you really thought about them. Well, I remember my graduation is a little bit less orthodox, like, the cap and robe and all of that. And yet there's something powerful about a ceremony like that marks a transition. I think some people like graduating from a higher learning institution so much that now we have some graduation ceremonies. I think even Mr. Incredible was ranting about having too many graduations. He's moving from the 4th grade to the 5th grade. But I like the intent behind it, where you're marking the passage, or you're like one grade moving to another. Okay, we can debate that. But graduating from high school or graduating from college, that's important to mark the passage of the student into either practicing these things in the real world, or maybe even you become a teacher. The mentored has become the mentor. And I think, particularly for some kinds of personalities or particular kinds of Christians, and I've struggled with this too, but I think others struggle with it more. There's this idea that, as I mentioned earlier, fantasy and fantastical stories, those are for kids. And if you enjoy it now, best not to talk about it. It's kind of an awkward subject. Or maybe, especially if you move into the ministry, if you're a missionary or a theologian or a professor or a pastor even, you keep that stuff to the side. It's a guilty pleasure, but does it really have anything to do with the preaching and the work of serious ministry as a Christian in the world? And against this, of course, is the C.S. Lewis being very stubborn, but also Lewis saying something like his dedication to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where he says, quote, "I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales. By the time it is printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can then take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate godfather, C.S. Lewis." You yourself are now a grandfather many times over. I'm curious how you hear this quote and like how you apply it, like maybe even at graduation ceremonies or to students that you speak to. how might you be encouraging them to enjoy these kinds of stories, not just as formative influences as kids or teenagers, but as very present help to help illustrate these deeper gospel truths?
Well, that's awesome. I love that dedicatory comment that you cited there. Lewis also, I'm trying to remember, it might have been a collection of essays that they wrote for Charles Williams, but he and Tolkien both make this point about, some people treat fairy stories as if they were like furniture for babies. You keep it in the nursery, but once you outgrow it, it's you can't sit in that chair anymore. But of course, that's, as we both know, that is not the case. I mean, a good story is a good story, and human nature is human nature. Lewis actually said he didn't, in a sense, didn't write children's stories because he wasn't trying to write down to water things down. I had a renewal of my love of fantasy. I went through the same thing where I, as a kid, read a lot of it, and through certain years, but I fortunately got back to it a little bit earlier with the Narnia Chronicles. I was in my 20s when I picked up the Narnia Chronicles and read them through. And the Space Trilogy, I loved the Space Trilogy. That was so powerful. I was in my 20s when I read Tolkien, and I still read Tolkien. I go back and read Lord of the Rings. I'm listening to it again right now for one of several times. I'm so struck by the beauty of it. The story of the Bible itself is a liberating discovery that allows you to embrace story once again. If you're preaching a sermon or teaching a lesson, you can almost open the Lord of the Rings and just find a spot, and there'll be something there that illustrates some great truth of life, because it speaks to human nature. I mean, these are hobbits and wizards and dwarves and elves, but they all speak from a human heart. It's powerful. I one of the best compliments I ever got was I had a friend who's now almost 90, but he was into his 80s when he started reading the series that I'm writing. And he said he loved the main character. He identified with him, the main character being mostly about 12 years old. That was a wonderful, wonderful compliment, and was looking forward to the next iteration. So a good story is just a good story. I mean, there's no age limits, except for maybe just the ability to read and kind of age limits that you'd have for any good writing or reading. But it's powerful. I suspect more adults read the Narnia Chronicles now than children do. Our excuse is we read them to our children and grandchildren. They're so powerful. I'm trying to think of the name. There's another author I've not recently, but a few years ago read. You're going to have to help me remember now. I shouldn't have started this sentence. But he's they were made into movies, but they kind of flopped. He's an atheist, and he was sort of the arch.
Oh, Philip Pullman, the anti-Lewis from the Parallel Earth. That's right.
Exactly. Philip Pullman. He has a certain beauty in his writing, but they are very, very dark. And it doesn't surprise me that they were a cinematic failure, because they don't speak to the human condition in quite the way that our hearts yearn for.
Well, another example is popularly the Game of Thrones series, which I've not seen because I'm a Christian. And aside from all the pornographic and violent content they put in there, the violence simulated, the pornography real, the series famously or infamously ends on such a dour note, not just because the original author still hasn't finished his version of it, infamously so, very long delay there, but because, by all accounts, the story had nowhere to go but this sort of nihilistic direction. If the whole thing is a subversion of the Tolkienian view of fantasy, which is always ending with a eucatastrophe of some kind to awaken that love and that longing for everything wrong being suddenly made right, this eternal scope that's reflected in the Lord of the Rings, and then along comes J.R.R. Martin, who's saying, well, that's not how it is in reality. It jolly well is how it is in reality, sir. You just can't see it yet. And so people, I think it's kind of past now. It was a fad, but people thought, oh, this is so adult. Oh, this is how things really are. This is violence and corruption, and all the good men die young, and all of the crooks and vagabonds are the only ones left. But that is not reality. That is just a snapshot of reality. It is blinkered reality. And I think it was inevitable that the series descended into the mess that it did, where even the actors apparently were pretty disillusioned with how it all fell apart there at the end. Again, I've not seen it. I'm just relying on secondhand sources here. But I think that's a great disarming of this notion that, well, adults should read grown-up books, very, very grown-up books about reality. It's not that, no, you need to get rid of reality and be a child again, and this romantic view of childhood and such. It's that is not reality. That is not biblical reality. That is not the eucatastrophe that we expect at the end. Actual reality is more complicated than that, and yet often also more simple.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. That's well said. The Lord of the Rings can be so, the gloom can be at times a preponderant mood or note, but underneath it all, there is this, hope in the midst of all the pain, the sufferings, the pilgrimage, the travel, the weariness, the bleakness, hope, in the sense that we must do our duty, we must do what's right. It permeates it, and it supports this entire structure of it. So I'm like you. I haven't read. I couldn't stand one page of the Thrones series for the reasons you've said.
Yeah, I just don't see how that could be realistic. My theory there, although I don't want to judge people's motives too harshly, is that folks who have had a fairly sheltered life feel like this is a way to bust up the sheltering and discover what reality is really like. Out there, as Lewis said, with the remains plastered against the wall, screw tape, Lewis says, the demons really want you to get confused about what reality is. And so they will say that the positive experiences, the mountaintop experiences of seeing a light through a stained glass window, well, that's just a fleeting illusion. But here's what life is really like out here. It's violence and gore. And I see that as a rather immature approach, maybe from someone who didn't read the good kinds of stories growing up.
It really is. It's not true to the world as we know it. It's not true to reality. It's not true to human nature. And it just descends into, as you said, into nihilism.
It does, which is not a very biblical approach to the world, but it's also not very helpful to your flourishing as a human being, even apart from the biblical worldview considerations. One of the things that I've appreciated just growing older is that you can enjoy, this may be again cribbing from Lewis, but you can enjoy not fewer stories, but more. You can keep the good stuff that you enjoyed as a child and as a teen and as a young adult, if it's good stuff, where the authors have built in little secrets to be unlocked if you go back and reread it again, like Easter eggs. Yeah, we just had Easter. And when you get older, maybe a little wiser, maybe read a little bit more, and you can start to pick up on these hidden ideas and subtext that a good author will put into the story. Suddenly, you can enjoy even more things if you keep on reading and don't lose the habit, grown up. If you're not too distracted by screens or limited time or even the need to parent, you can enjoy more. You can get more out of the good stories. Now, I don't mean, well, we need to go back and reread slop or the more thoughtless stuff. It was good for its time, but you don't need to go back to that well. It's run dry, if it ever had anything in it, to mix some metaphors here. But grown-ups get to enjoy more stuff and thereby train children to do the same. We can help the young adults and the teenagers to go along the same journey that we've done, and thereby live up to that challenge. And that's not just academics. That's discipleship. You can do that sort of thing even if you've never been to college or university.
Absolutely. The more we read, the older we get. One hopes wiser. You simply learn more and more how to read. And you have a greater depth of experience with which to interpret and understand what it is you may have read a long time ago, but you see something new in it day by day.
So on that note, as we close, I'm curious if you can improv a 60 to 90-second commencement for anyone listening to this episode. And I hope you don't mind doing it for free. Anyone who's listening to this episode who is either recently graduated or knows a graduate, whether high school or college, or who's just thinking about his or her graduation and how the commencement speech was actually really pathetic, and what would they have wanted to hear to encourage them specifically about fiction and imagination, moving from being a student to being an adult. Do you have any parting thoughts for a listener like that?
Yeah, okay. To a recent graduate, be a good steward of what you've been given. You've been given an incredible opportunity to learn, to grow, to think. You've been given an unusual period of time in life, 4, 5, 6 years, to do things that most people in this world only dream of doing, and that is to read, to study, to listen to great scholars, to have dedicated times for discussion. So number one, be a good steward of what you've learned. Number two, be willing to share your experience in the world around you. You're entering into a world, you have a vocation, you're called to be salt and light in the world, to make a difference in the world. So as you're a steward of what you've learned and are grateful for it, be willing to share it. Thirdly, I would say you're going to experience trouble. You're going to experience affliction. You're going to experience a world of suffering. But do not let that lead you down the path to despair. In this world, we have tribulation, but be of good cheer. He has overcome the world. The great story of the Bible is the story of a final restoration, a great day when God is going to make all things right again. So in faithfulness, in a world of trouble now, take what you've learned, share it with others, live with patience, perseverance, and moral courage in the world in which you find it, as you find it, and live as a person of hope. Be a steward of hope in this world.
Amen. And amen times 10. I wish I'd gotten a commencement like that, maybe a little longer, but it's always a bonus to get a New Heavens and New Earth reference in there. In fact, I think it's a bonus to get that reference into basically any conversation, because that's the ending of the story. That's the eucatastrophe that is real, more real than any of the suffering and violence and tough challenges that we have on the way, on the journey. Dr. Sloan, so great to have you here. Where can folks keep track of your work, not just at the university, but with the Hamelin Stoop series? Give us some links to close us out.
Yeah, you can find the books, of course, on Amazon, but 12 Gates Publishing is the website. 12gates.com, 12gates.com is the way to find us. And you can look me up and look up Hamelin Stoop, and a number of ways will come up, but 12gatespublishing.com.
Gotcha. 12gatespublishing.com. And of course, we'll have all those links in the show notes. Well, we'll let you ride back out. I guess not into the sunset, because that's where you came from, but I guess you'll ride back out into the sunrise, which is a fun way to reverse expectation. But we're so glad that you cleared time in your busy schedule to visit the studio this day.
Stephen, thank you so much. It's been a joy to be with you. Thanks for letting me sort of experience your expertise in these matters. It's great to be on this program.
Well, it's not every day you get a university president who has written middle grade fantasy from a Christian worldview perspective in this studio, but you meet all types in this little industry, little getting medium. So really appreciate Dr. Sloan making some time available right before his very busy graduation season cranks up for the spring. What are some memorable graduations that you've attended? Have you ever heard any clunker graduation speeches or some really, really good and inspirational ones? Did anybody quote Tolkien or C.S. Lewis up front? And then, of course, I have to ask, what books have you loved, not just as a grown-up or as a teenager, but ever since childhood? What are the stories that truly matter that you held on to because you wanted to remember that there's some good in this world? Email us to tell us at podcast@lorehaven.com. You can also seek us out on the socials, Facebook, Instagram, and X. Get your social media fix there. We're a little over long here, so I shan't be reading any more comm station stuff right now, but I'm sure we will have more in the future, especially because I'll be heading to Florida within another week or so. So I'll have plenty of reports to bring back and some feedback from some of you listeners out there in the wild or the wilds of Florida. Oh, by the way, I'm also going to a writers conference after that, so I'll mention that as well in an upcoming episode. Next on Fantastical Truth, as mentioned, we're doing a different kind of story here, a time travel romance. Catherine needs no magical stone, slingshot maneuvers around the sun, or fantastic phone box. She can time travel quite naturally. She falls asleep in Victorian London, only to wake up in the World War II era. But now she is caught up in a quest to save her sister from Jack the Ripper. She also needs to choose only one timeline to live in before her 25th birthday. Every hour until then, author Gabriel Meyer joins us to explore what is time travel romance and why do readers love it. Many readers have loved stories like this ever since they were kids. I can name several titles like that myself. Chronicles of Narnia, of course, but also many others. If the story is good, then it's going to last. Read it again. Tell your friends about it. Know that, as Lewis once said, someday we will be old enough to enjoy fairy tales again. So let's enjoy them for God's glory as we continue to seek and find His fantastical truth.